I drew this gum tree overlooking Sydney Harbour using a 3B pencil yesterday. It made me wonder how different would it look if I was to redraw it in ink using a 0.3mm fine liner. So I'll redraw it now, and at the end we'll compare the two together. I'd love to hear as a comment which one you think, this pencil one or the ink one I'm about to draw, works better. But for now, let's start the ink drawing. This ink version took me 60 minutes to draw, which was maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes longer than the pencil drawing took, which was much closer together for the time than I expected. I thought this would take me significantly longer, given the, if you like, finer nature of the marks that I'm going to be making with the pen. Now, you'll notice I did my usual tree technique approach of dotted lines to represent the canopies so that I could work the proportions out of the various major elements of the foliage before I began to commit to hatching to create value. But similarly, as with my pencil drawing yesterday, I'm not wanting to draw an outline around the tree. I'm not wanting to draw certainly outline edges to the canopies. I'm wanting to suggest a far more nuanced silhouette, something that does actually reflect the appearance of the edge of the canopies that we see in life. I'm also at this stage going consciously lighter. I'm wanting to do a few darker patches, but not as dark as they're going to be. I'm also wanting to hatch the entire canopy, including the parts in full sunlight, because I want the tree to stand out against the sky, because visually that's the impression we get in the photo, in reality, and I really liked that, the way the tree is so much more the star of the show, through looking through most of it and seeing the sky. So the other challenge will be to capture the feeling that there is this low ridge across the harbour that goes behind the lower section of the tree, and not to let that visually stop us from seeing the tree as clearly as it is in life. Of course, in life, we have the colour as well as the value and the form to also help us see the distinctions. And we're not going to have the colour, obviously, in this tree. Now, notice that I do establish the canopies first, and then I do the linking of the branches. And I really like the fact that with the pen now, I can get some really thin, clean lines to connect, particularly those upper canopies, with the really quite small branching that supports them. A really common flaw I see over and over again is that branches are just too thick when they enter the canopy to disappear completely into twigs, very fine twigs, by the time they attach to leaves. Always better to err on the side of drawing branches too thin. It's easier to thicken them when we're drawing with ink than to try and thin them. And now I'm just starting to work back and forth across the canopy. I want to try and get a sense of the whole thing, but I'm really now drawing by value. I've established if you like, the outer perimeter of the canopies. And now I'm adding the shadows really before I do anything else. Now there is this darker patch that's shadowed by higher up canopies on the further side of the tree. And so I know that's going to be quite dark. So I'm doing that a bit darker straight off. And that will then help me balance the other values of the tree as I go. You'll notice that some of these branches I'm drawing by drawing black lines with the white behind, but other branches I'm drawing by drawing the shadows behind them so that those branches appear white, where we have sunlight on the branches, or at least more light than on other parts. Those branches look light on dark against dark, and it's certainly easier to capture that effect with pen than with pencil, I'll say. And it's a very common bounce between positive and negative spacing to represent branching in drawing a tree. It's one that I particularly enjoy doing. It just takes a little bit of planning early on because we have to make sure we preserve the paper, the white, where we want that to happen. And again, notice when I did that branch, I left a bit of a gap in it. I didn't do long continuous lines because there was just a hint of foliage coming in front of that branch from our viewpoint. And I wanted to create that sense of three dimensions, that this element is in front of that element. And again, if we rush to draw lots of long lines, we take away from ourselves options that we might like to have a bit later to create a three-dimensional effect, which is why I think of drawing in marks and not lines, because marks as a mindset reminds me that there's lots of options available for the entire drawing process, whether it's establishing where things are going to go at the start and right up to the final finish of hatching and lines and emphasis and other things that we might want to do. So working back and forth, trying to really make sure that in general terms I capture the lights and the darks to represent the foliage, and not just the foliage but the overall shape of the tree, where we look through the tree, where we see things further away. I really want to capture what's in this tree. When I look at a lot of drawings that people do, the trees end up all looking generic. Now, sometimes the reference tree was a pretty generic looking tree, but often it's because there is a sense of we don't need to be as precise drawing what's there when we draw a tree, that people won't know as long as it looks like a tree. But invariably when we do that, the tree looks less distinctive, less striking, less interesting. And we tend to simplify it as well as generalizing the marks. So if we're drawing a tree as the subject, particularly if we've chosen a tree because we think it's a really nice looking tree, it's really visually attention grabbing in some way, then we really want to do our best to capture that tree in that lighting from whatever distance we're looking at it from. And so now this whole scene is very zoomed in. I was actually on the other side of Circular Quay at a cafe at the top of the Museum of Contemporary Art when I drew this. So this is highly zoomed, but parts of it are still closer to me than others, and I'm really trying to draw this as if I were considerably closer to it than I actually was. So I want this foreground foliage to really come forward. And look, it really is just a big blob of foliage. So it's going to be hard not to make it look like a big blob. I want it to feel closer, so it has to have some stronger emphasis. And yet I want the tree to be the eye attention, to be the eye-grabbing attention piece. So that's my challenge. And why I'm trying to make sure that I bring as much clarity into the tree and our ability to see the tree. Have this foreground, this railing that's part of the perimeter railing of the Sydney Botanic Gardens, and to the left of this tree the ground drops down. You can see that we've cut into the sandstone ridge here. This ridge drops down, and then we have the Opera House forecourt and then the Opera House. So this really is probably the gum tree with one of the best views in Sydney of all the views that gum trees have. And it's wonderful that it's still there because it's a reasonably old one. So just doing those railings, I'm again wanting a sense of these are close, there's foreshortening involved. I have simplified the foreground a bit because if I put too much of the detail that's there in the reference in my drawing, or tried to anyway, it would become too cluttered. It would start to draw the eye. To get definition, I'd have to make some parts darker than I want overall, because I want what I'm drawing now to be one of the darker areas. But I don't want it to be like black dark. I'm not colouring in, I'm hatching, even if they're with long lines, but they're long, light lines that are close together. I'm holding the pen at quite an angle. This pen's probably only got 3/4 of the ink flowing through it that it should have, which gives me a lot more variability with my lines. In fact, this is actually, no, I have switched to a 0.2, and I finished up switching back in the end to my 0.3 because I found I could get a lighter, finer line with a slightly dried up pen of the next width above than the one below, which had a full flow of ink. So I'm now doing this palm tree, and I really wanted to work on the silhouette of this to really bring a sense of this is a palm tree, because all the rest of the foliage is pretty much the same. This is the only bit of foliage where I get to very clearly show that there's a different plant. And Sydney has a lot of palms around the harbour. There were native palm trees all over Sydney Harbour, a few of which survive in areas that were very steep and weren't able to be accessed to cut them down. A lot of the palm trees were cut down in the first days of the European colony because they were easy temporary timber poles to use in the first buildings. And so now I'm experimenting, exploring with the lines at the back, but determined to go very lightly because I don't want to detract from the darkness, the values of the tree, and I certainly want to make sure that the trunk stands out. So as I put some value behind the trunk, you'll see that at times I darken the trunks, either by putting a little more hatching going horizontally, which also helps to make it look separate from the hatching behind, but also with edging sometimes as well, just increasing the emphasis of the ink on the edging. And so I'm fairly happy with that and the sense that it sits forward. There'll just be a few adjustments back and forth, but basically I feel like I've got this now, and I didn't want quite the bare white strips going behind, but I also didn't want to add too much to it as well. So I took this fairly slowly. You're watching most of this at 4 times my drawing speed. If you want to slow it down to watch a little more carefully, use the cog icon. You can slow it down to half speed, which will make it double speed, which I think does seem a fairly reasonable speed to watch. And then it's done, and it's time to uncover and to compare with the pencil drawing. There's always a few extra bits to do, aren't there? Trying to remember not to go over that margin, that edge, now that I've taken the tape off, because I've made that mistake before. And then I'm pretty much done. What do you think? Here they are side by side. And I've got to say, more than anything, I'm struck by the similarities between the two rather than the differences. But I definitely have a clear favourite. And as I said, I'd love to hear which one you think works better in the comments. And being honest, the ink drawing had the advantage that it was the second one. So I was not only that much more familiar with my subject, but I had a focus regarding the things that I didn't think worked as well in the pencil drawing when I drew the pen version. I often talk about the value of redrawing a scene in that we can immediately apply the things that we're conscious of that frustrated us, where we made choices that perhaps in hindsight we would have made differently. We get to put all that into practice and see not just how it looks, but what it feels like to progress the drawing in that way. My biggest frustration with the pencil was that I felt it somehow just lacked a bit of clarity with the depths of plane, that this foreground, this closest part, and this furthest part, mark-wise, looked a bit the same, both in value and in the type of marks. And while the marks for the tree are a little bit tighter, a little bit smaller and tighter, generally it still tends to blend in all a bit too much for my liking. And I feel that these trunks got a bit lost in the background as well. Towards the end of this drawing, I began to get a bit frustrated because my pencil was blunting and therefore my lines were becoming wider and wider, and I wasn't necessarily prepared for that for the marks I was wanting to make. So when I drew this ink version today, I was conscious of all of that. I deliberately kept my lines with the tree lighter, planning to come back later and darker and darker. I wanted hatching on all of the tree, even the parts of the foliage in full sunlight, because I wanted the contrast between the foliage and the sky. But I was also determined to keep this background hatching a lot lighter, and particularly when it was behind the branches, to work hard to be alternating dark and light, 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 and even strengthening a few of the outer lines for the trunk and branches. In this foreground, although I used the same pen, I pressed a little bit more heavily and did a few more edging lines compared to what I did in the pencil. And I feel that helped to bring this forward, as well as the fact that I was making some heavier marks and more of them. So to me, this foliage here definitely feels closer. Then we have this tree here behind. This palm tree is a bit behind this eucalyptus, and then across the harbour, I think the rendering of the wooded ridgeline behind works better. While I think these horizontal lines for the water work well in both, I think the darker contrast I have here between this and this areas work better. I've got to say, I did really appreciate with the pen the ease to keep clarity through being able to control the line width more precisely. So for me, the ink one is the winner. So please let me know in the comments what you think. This photo is already posted on my community page from yesterday. So if you didn't draw it in pencil yesterday, why not draw it in pen today? G'day, I'm Stephen Travis. Hope you found this interesting and a bit of fun. I certainly did. But whatever you draw, however many times you draw it, in whatever you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.